Have you ever seen a house in a tree? It seems a very funny idea to me. Anyway, this story is called The Tree House. "Please, Mum, can I go to Roger's house?" Jimmy asked his mother, Ruth, one day when he was feeling rather bored. I don't know," Ruth hesitated. "You won't ever play on the floor with his Scalextric cars or sit around for hours doing those silly computer games. It's such a nice day. Why don't you ask Roger to come over here so you can run around in the garden?" "But, Mum," Jimmy protested, "there's nothing to do in the garden except play football, and we don't want to do that all the time." Ruth didn't want to have a bored boy around the house whining all day, so she finally gave in. "All right then, Jimmy," she said with a sigh, "but I want you back by lunchtime, and please don't get in the way of Roger's mum. She's a very busy lady." Jimmy gave a whoop and was out of the house in less than a minute. Later that day, there was a toot-toot in the lane as a very smart van stopped outside the doctor's house. It was Ruth's father, Alistair Stewart, although everyone now called him Grandpa Ali. "I was just passing by and thought I'd come and see how my fine grandsons are doing." "Well, Dad, you'll find little Freddie in his playroom upstairs, but I'm afraid Jimmy is off playing at his friend Roger's house." "Och, no matter," Grandpa Ali chuckled. "I'll see the wee laddie soon enough." Grandpa Ali didn't speak like English people because he came from a big city in Scotland called Glasgow. He had left that country many years ago, but he still sounded very Scottish. Indeed, a lot of English people couldn't always understand what he was saying. Grandpa Ali was a carpenter. He wasn't just any old carpenter. He was a very special one, because he made very beautiful and expensive furniture that only rich people could afford to buy. He made tables, chairs, sideboards, cabinets, sideboards, bookcases, or anything that people needed, so long as it could be made of wood and they had plenty of money to spend. Of course, Grandpa Ali didn't do all this on his own. 9 people worked for him in a large workshop that had lots of machines and special tools in it. Grandpa Ali loved working with wood. Even in his spare time he used to make things, especially for little children. When Jimmy was 1 year old and still crawling, Grandpa Ali made him a trolley with wheels that he could stretch up and push. That way he learned how to walk. After that he got a wheelbarrow and a small tricycle. Of course, Jimmy was a bit old for these things now, and so had given them to Freddie, who thought they were really fantastic. "You know, Dad," Ruth complained, "Jimmy always seems to be indoors these days. I wish I could think of something that would get him to play outside in the fresh air." Grandpa Ali had heard this before. He had volunteered to make Jimmy a go-kart racer with a special steering wheel that he could ride in the lane, but Ruth said it would be too dangerous because the lane did not have any pavements, and she was worried Jimmy would have an accident. Grandpa's next thought was a climbing frame in the garden. At first, Ruth thought that was a good idea, but then remembered Freddie would also want to go on it. He was still far too small, and she feared he might fall off it. The only thing that Grandpa Ali had been allowed to do was to put a swing at the end of the garden, where it swung from the sturdy branch of a large beech tree. But, sadly, not even this was exciting enough to keep Jimmy in the garden when there were games he could play on an iPad. Grandpa thought for a while. He tried to remember all the things and all the adventures he had loved when he was a small boy in Scotland. Then an idea suddenly crossed his mind. Without saying a word, he went out of the house to his van and came back with a tape measure. "What's up?" asked Ruth. It was obvious that Grandpa Ali had a plan. "Follow me," he said as he led Ruth into the garden. It was a very long garden where, beyond the lawn, there were rhododendron bushes and the occasional fruit tree. Finally, they came to the big beech tree. Grandpa Ali looked up at it to see how the branches were shaped and how strong they were. Then he put his tape measure around the tree to see how thick it was. "Aye, that'll do just fine," he chuckled with satisfaction. "A nice strong tree," he confirmed. "What on earth are you doing?" Ruth looked very puzzled for a moment. She thought her father was planning to chop down the tree so he could make more furniture. "Tree house," he explained triumphantly. "I'll make a tree house for Jimmy." "Oh, no, you don't," Ruth immediately replied. "I'm not having Jimmy falling out of it and seeing him in plaster for weeks." "Ach, dinna fash yoursel, lassie," Grandpa Ali retorted, which in English means, "Don't worry yourself, girl." "I'd make it so safe a 90-year-old granny could live up there." Ruth thought about it and was trying to decide when Jimmy suddenly appeared. "Hello, Grandpa," he said, running towards the old man and hugging his leg. What are you doing with Mum here in the garden?" Jimmy had seen them both looking at the beech tree. "Well, young Jimmy, I was thinking of building a house up there," Grandpa Ali mischievously informed as he stole a glance at Ruth. "Oh, cool, really cool," Jimmy exploded, jumping up and down with excitement. Ruth was annoyed. "You crafty old man," she said to her father. "Now that you've said that to Jimmy, I suppose I'll have to agree." "Aye, lassie, I suppose you will," Grandpa Ali declared, looking triumphant. Of course, Jimmy wanted the tree house immediately, but Grandpa Ali said it would take a lot of work and that he could only spare the time to do it at weekends. So, most Saturdays and Sundays, he would turn up at the doctor's house. Sometimes he would bring one of his apprentices. These were very young men who he was teaching how to be carpenters. They would get tools, wood, nails, screws, bolts and brackets out of the van and take them to the back of the house. There they would measure the wood, cut it, and assemble it. Then, at the end of the garden and standing on ladders, they would start fitting it to the tree. They tried to do this, causing as little harm to the tree as possible. The tree was a living thing, so instead of injuring it with screws and bolts, they attached their cut wooden beams using special clamps that did not penetrate the bark. There was lots of sawing, chiseling and banging for many weekends during late spring and early summer. Jimmy, Freddie and Roger were fascinated as they saw the various sections of the treehouse gradually take shape. They could already see it was going to be quite a large one, bigger even than the Wendy house Jimmy's cousin Maisie had. Jimmy couldn't wait for the treehouse to be finished and kept asking Grandpa Ali when it would be ready. "Patience, laddie," he would say. "You'll be up and in it soon enough." Finally, one Saturday afternoon, the treehouse was fully erected, sitting magnificent and invitingly between the branches of the beech tree. The only thing Grandpa Ali had to do now was to make a little staircase. He had thought about a simple ladder, but Ruth was frightened Jimmy, and especially Freddie, would fall off it. A staircase would be a much safer option. So Jimmy had his finished treehouse, but still had no means of getting into it. It was extremely frustrating. He was desperate to try it out. That evening, Grandpa Ali and one of his apprentices stayed for dinner. Freddie had been put to bed at 6:30, and after a long and exciting day, Jimmy followed him at 8:30. The trouble was, Jimmy couldn't get to sleep. He was still thinking about the treehouse. It was as if it was saying to him, "Why don't you come and have another look? I'm going to be so much fun." In the end, Jimmy could not resist it any longer. He got out of bed, put on his slippers, and quietly opened his bedroom door. He could hear the grown-ups talking and laughing in the dining room, but was still careful not to make any noise as he crept down the stairs, avoiding all the steps that he knew might squeak or crack. Quickly moving through the kitchen, he came to the back door, opened it, and leapt off the step into the garden. It was a very warm evening, bringing out the perfumes of flowers and the buzzing of insects in search of nectar. A thrush and 2 blackbirds were on the long stretch of lawn, still hoping to find worms for their supper. Jimmy moved stealthily along the side of the garden so as not to be seen, but as soon as he got to hedges that would conceal him, he started to run. He kept running until he finally found himself at the beech tree. There he had a very big surprise. Propped against it was Grandpa Alley's ladder. He had forgotten to take it away. "Wow!" said Jimmy. This was too good an opportunity to ignore. He immediately grabbed the ladder, putting his right foot on the bottom rung, and began to climb. It didn't take him long before he got to the top, which led straight to the open door of the tree house. Jimmy looked inside and saw there was plenty of space. It all smelt wonderfully of fresh, newly cut wood. "I could get at least 3 of my friends in here," he gasped, eyes wide open in wonderment. Suddenly he took hold of one side of the doorway and hauled his right leg over the ladder and onto the treehouse floor. At last he was inside. He walked around, looking out of each window, and although the tree was in full leaf, partly obscuring some views, he could still see across all the surrounding fields and their farmhouses. After 20 minutes, dreaming of all the adventures he was going to have, Jimmy began to feel rather tired. Although there were no bed, pillows, or a duvet, he simply lay down, very content, on the wood floor, and, without realizing it, he was soon fast asleep. Back in the house, Grandpa Alley suddenly declared, "Well, that was a fine meal, Ruth. We'd better be off now, but before that, I've just remembered. I left the ladder down at the beech tree." Grandpa Alley never liked to leave ladders or tools around at night, because he always feared someone like a thief or a burglar might come along and take them. "I'll just go and get it and pop it in your garage until tomorrow." Grandpa Alley and his apprentice strolled down to the end of the garden, came to the beech tree and took down their ladder. They had no idea at all that not far above, Jimmy was having a very nice sleep. Next day, very early, Jimmy began to stir. He had been woken by the loud cawing of crows in the top of the trees. At first he wasn't sure where he was. He had forgotten that he had climbed into the tree house. He thought that was rather funny, but he soon changed his mind. When he opened the door to descend to the ground, he was shocked to find the ladder wasn't there any more. "Who's taken my ladder?" he shouted, but no one answered. He was too far down the garden for anyone to hear, and anyway, they were probably all still in bed. Jimmy kept shouting for some time, "Mum! Dad! Help! I'm in the tree house!" But nobody came. After a while, Jimmy started to get worried. He was hungry and he wanted something to drink. He wondered if he would be able to climb down the tree, but there were no lower branches for him to cling on to. He even thought about jumping, but it was a fearful long way down and far too dangerous. No, he would just have to sit and wait until somebody realized he was missing. Jimmy's parents did not get up early because today, Sunday, was their day off. They were usually woken by Freddie because he was always hungry and needed his breakfast. Jimmy would then follow, bleary-eyed, but today he was nowhere to be seen. "Freddie, where's Jimmy?" Ruth asked the tiny boy. Freddie couldn't speak yet and simply shook his head. Ruth then went to check in Jimmy's room. He wasn't there. Then she checked other rooms, but Jimmy was nowhere to be seen. I wonder if the silly boy is hiding, she said, looking rather annoyed. After 10 minutes, Ruth and Philip realized Jimmy was not in the house. They had also looked out of the garden window, and still there was no sign of him. Ruth began to get very worried. This is so unlike Jimmy, she said, beginning to panic. What if he's gone off wandering in the lane? Philip had been very quiet, trying to think of all the things that could have happened, and then he had a brilliant thought. Come with me, Ruth, he said. So they both put on their dressing gowns and slippers. Philip led Ruth into the garden. Why are we in the garden? Ruth asked, looking puzzled. You'll see, Philip replied without giving any explanation. After walking down the garden path for some distance, Ruth and Philip thought they heard the faint noise of someone shouting. As they got closer, the shouting became clearer. Mum, Dad, help! Ruth and Philip began to run. They ran until they got to the beech tree, where they saw Jimmy sitting in the doorway of the treehouse, dangling his legs in thin air. You twit! Philip shouted up at Jimmy, and began to laugh. Jimmy soon forgot the little fright he had with the treehouse, especially when, 2 weeks later, Grandpa Alley installed a narrow staircase. It had rails on either side so that nobody could fall off it. At last, Jimmy could use the little house safely and whenever he liked. Roger was Jimmy's first guest into the treehouse. Roger had been aching to get into it for weeks, as he had followed the progress of its construction. Roger had an older sister, Trudy, who was also allowed in, and when Jimmy's cousin Maisie heard about it, she thought they should all have a tea party in the treehouse with orange drinks and cream cakes. Of course, by this time Grandpa Alley had made small wooden stools and a tiny table for such events to take place. Ruth's hope that Jimmy would spend more time in the fresh air had now been fulfilled. If ever you wanted to find Jimmy, all you had to do was go and look in the treehouse. He and Roger spent lots of time there. Sometimes it was a fort where they had to repel Red Indians. Sometimes it was part of a ship under attack from pirates. And sometimes it was a spaceship aimed at the moon, Mars or Venus. On other occasions, the boys were just content to read comics or adventure books. As the summer progressed, the land became very warm and very dry. There hadn't been any rain for weeks and weeks. Grass was going yellow and brown for lack of water, and it was far too hot for doing any running about. But up in the treehouse, it was much cooler. Branches and leaves shaded it from the sun, and soft breezes wafted refreshingly through its open windows. Almost hidden in foliage, the treehouse had become a secret place. People could not see Jimmy and Roger, but they could see everything and everyone. This was made easy because Roger's father let him borrow his really powerful binoculars. Now don't drop it out of that tree house, he had warned. Otherwise you'll have to pay for a new one out of your pocket money. The threat was very real, and both boys looked after the binoculars very carefully. One day those binoculars became very useful indeed. Jimmy was looking out of one of the treehouse windows when he thought he saw something different. Can I borrow your binoculars? He asked Roger. Roger wanted to know why. I think I can see smoke, Jimmy replied, trying to focus the binoculars by turning a small wheel. Oh, probably a barbecue or a bonfire, Roger suggested without showing much interest. Well, if it's a barbecue, then it's a really huge one, Jimmy countered. He now had a better idea of what it was, now that he could see it through the binoculars. I think I'm going to tell Mum. Jimmy began to race down the staircase with Roger following. By the time they got to the kitchen door, both boys were breathless. Come quick, Mum, we've seen a big fire, Jimmy shouted out to Ruth. At first she thought it was just a load of fuss, but Jimmy was so desperate she decided it would be better to go and see. She had never been in a tree house because it was for children, and she was too tall, but somehow she squeezed in by bending very low. Golly, she gasped after looking through the binoculars. It really is a fire, and it's burning one of Mr. Nicholson's wheat fields. He's going to lose his whole crop. I wonder if he knows about it. Then quickly, fumbling in her skirt pocket, she took out her mobile phone and dialed the emergency services. She told them exactly where to go. 10 minutes later, the boys and Ruth could hear sirens coming from far off. The sounds got louder, so Jimmy and Roger rushed up the garden and around the house into the lane, just in time to see 2 red fire engines and a police car shoot past them on their way to Mr. Nicholson's farm. Come on, let's see what's happening, Jimmy shouted at Roger above the noise. So both boys turned to run back to the tree house. When they climbed back in, they could see the fire was still raging and that it had begun to spread. They had expected to see flames, but these were blotted from view by huge clouds of smoke. Even at this distance, they could still hear the sound of the fire engines, but then, suddenly, there was silence. I think they've got there, Roger suggested. Sure enough, both boys could now see red vehicles whenever gaps appeared in the smoke. It was not long before the brave firemen had extinguished the blaze, although lots of black and white smoke continued to rise from the wheat field. They would stay there for some time, making sure there were no smouldering embers or sparks that could start another fire. Wow, that was great, Roger declared. It was lucky we had your binoculars, Jimmy replied. And even luckier that we had your tree house, otherwise we would never have seen it, Roger added, looking very serious. A week later, nothing more had been heard of the fire, but then there was a knock on the door one evening. Ruth went to open it. It was Farmer Nicholson. I thought I'd call in on you and the doctor, Ruth, because word's got round that you called the fire brigade. I just want to tell you how grateful I am. I didn't know there was a fire, and due to your quick action there wasn't much damage. It could have been a whole lot worse. Well, actually, it wasn't me that raised the alarm. It was my son Jimmy and his friend Roger, Ruth told the farmer. Farmer Nicholson insisted on seeing both boys to thank them, and as a special treat he said he would give them rides on his tractor and in his combine harvester. The boys were thrilled, but there was an even greater surprise 2 days later. Jimmy and Roger were in the tree house and about to come down to have their supper when they once again heard the loud sound of a fire engine siren, and it seemed to be coming from the lane right outside the house. Golly gosh, I hope there isn't another fire, Jimmy cried out as once again the boys rushed down the tree house's narrow staircase. Running as fast as they could through the garden and around the house, they were surprised to see a big fire engine parked outside the house. Firemen were standing next to it, all with their helmets on and smiling broadly. Are you the boys that told us about the fire over at Mr. Nicholson's place? The chief fireman asked. Yes, sir, both boys blurted at once. Well, your mums have just agreed that you can come for a ride in our fire engine. Here, put these 2 helmets on, please. Jimmy and Roger looked at each other in astonishment. They could hardly believe what was happening. The helmets were very large and wobbled a bit as both boys quickly clambered up into the front seat of the fire engine. Press that button, son, the chief fireman said to Jimmy. When he did so, pressing down as hard as he could on the button, there was a sudden, ear-splitting wailing from the siren. Next to them, the driver pressed the starter. The powerful diesel motor sprang into life, sending a vibration through the whole vehicle. The fire engine began to move. Ruth and Philip, together with Roger's mother and father, proudly waved from the side of the lane. "Okay, boys, we're off to the fire station now," informed the chief fireman. For Jimmy and Roger, it really felt like this was the best day of their lives.